For those of you I've not yet had the chance to meet, my name is John Hybush. I'm the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you, and there are a lot of you here this evening. Once Mrs. Reagan and her special guest arrive at their seats, I'd like to ask all of you to please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my distinct honor to welcome former First Lady Nancy Reagan, escorted by her special guest, Mr. Ben Stein. Now, in honor of our men and women in uniform who are defending our freedom around the world, would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize some special guests that we have with us this evening. First, President Reagan's ambassador to the Court of St. James, Charles Price, and his wife, Carol. Thank you for coming, Ambassador. The Consul General of Hungary, Ambassador Balázs Bokor. The Consul General of the United Kingdom, Dame Barbara Hay. And our terrific congressman who has done so much to support the Reagan Library over the years, Elton Gallagher, and his wife, Janice. I'd also like to mention that tonight's event is sponsored by our good friends and through the generosity of the Charles and Ann Johnson Foundation. Our guest this evening, Ben Stein, in addition to being one of the most famous and talented Renaissance men in America, is special. I say that because one would have to search long and hard to find an individual whose career, to a point, bears such an uncanny resemblance to that of Ronald Reagan's. While the two are very different men, interestingly, their lives have played out with remarkable similarity. And for those who, after careful study, might find a career resemblance between the two, but would point to the fact that Ben has not yet been President of the United States, I would note that there is still plenty of time for that. I am sure that Ben might squirm in his seat a bit as I compare him to one of our greatest presidents. I know that he has no political aspirations, nor does his modesty allow him to see himself in the same orbit as Ronald Reagan. But let's turn a few pages of history and note the parallels. As a young man, Ronald Reagan studied economics in school. So too Ben Stein. He studied economics at Columbia and graduated with honors. Ronald Reagan was a movie star, having appeared in numerous films. So too Ben Stein. He is particularly well known for his role in the film Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where his appearance was recently ranked as one of the 50 most famous scenes in American film. Yes, but what about television? Ronald Reagan had his own television show for 8 years and appeared in countless commercials. So too Ben Stein. For 5 years, he hosted the Emmy Award-winning Win Ben Stein's Money and has appeared in numerous television commercials. Okay, let's turn to the role of newspaper columnist. Ronald Reagan wrote over 1,000 opinion pieces for a nationally syndicated newspaper column in the 1970s that appeared in hundreds of papers across the country. Ben Stein? Well, for years, he has been a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, the King's Feature Syndicate, Barron's, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Magazine, the list goes on. What about being a noted author? President Reagan wrote a few bestsellers from Where's the Rest of Me to An American Life. A2 Ben Stein? Well, yes, 30 books to be exact. His most recent one is one you can find on sale today at the library, which he has signed, called The Little Book of Bulletproof Investing, The Do's and Don'ts to Protect Your Financial Life. Yes, but has Ben tackled diaries? President Reagan was the most prolific diary writer of any American president. In fact, yes, Ben has written a lengthy diary for 20 years, published weekly in the American Spectator. At this point, some of Ben's fans in the audience would say, don't forget about presidential speech writing. I won't. Ben wrote speeches for the likes of former Presidents Nixon and Ford, and it is no secret that Ronald Reagan wrote presidential speeches as well for President Ronald Reagan. Fortunately, the parallels do not stop there. To this list of accomplishments between the two, I would add that there are qualities that both men shared that rise above what one will find on a resume. A marvelous sense of humor and wit, the courage to defy conventional wisdom, a common belief that it is the people of this country and not the government that are in charge, a deep commitment to family, patriotism, love of country, support for our men and women in uniform, and an obligation to help others. These are just some of the qualities that made our President Ronald Reagan great, and they are the qualities that make Ben Stein a pleasure to have with us tonight. So we are honored to have him here. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Ben Stein.
Thank you. Can you get used? Well, when we were getting ready, ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Reagan, when we were getting ready, a little bird told me this was going to be the most unusual introduction I'd ever gotten, and it certainly was. So thank you very, very much. I don't really deserve to. I would consider myself very lucky to have shined Ronald Reagan's shoes. So I'm very, very touched that you gave me that lavish and entirely undeserved introduction. But thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much for coming here. To come on the freeway at rush hour on any workday is a challenge. To come on this particularly foggy and overcast day is a real challenge. It is such an honor to be here. I can hardly tell you. As I was walking in with Mrs. Reagan, I looked around myself. I looked over at Mrs. Reagan. I said, I cannot believe this is my life. It's just unbelievable, just incredible. Obviously, I mean, I tell you no more than that water runs downhill to say the greatest First Lady of the post-war era inspired Ronald Reagan, in so doing inspired the whole world, loved Ronald Reagan, took care of him, in so doing loved and took care of all of men and women of goodwill on the entire planet. We're very grateful to have her in our midst. I'm flattered just to be standing 10 feet away from her. She was telling me as we were walking in here that when she started out at MGM, she sat at the commissary at the contract players table and then at the stars table, and As far as I'm concerned, she belonged at the stars table from her earliest childhood in Bethesda till now. And still, I think the only problem is she'd be alone at the stars table right now. There are no really stars to compare with her. So God bless you, Mrs. Reagan, and thank you for being here. And let's talk a little bit about, I usually start out telling a whole bunch of jokes, but because we have a time constraint, I'm not going to tell them to you. But if you sit near me at dinner, I will tell you some at dinner. Let's talk about where we are as a nation and about Ronald Wilson Reagan and what was so spectacular about him and why he is so much missed right now. Let's just start with the most basic point. Ronald Reagan loved freedom. He loved the freedom of the individual. He saw human rights as derived not from the state or the monarch or the Communist Party, but from God. To see where the rights of the human being come from, as Martin Luther King Jr. said in many a speech, you cannot look to any political document. You have to look back to the dim mists of the origins of mankind. These rights are God-given. Ronald Reagan saw that, and he saw and believed that the United States of America was the only reliable guardian and repository of human freedom on the planet. He saw from a very early age in Illinois, that America was not about money or power or grandeur. It was about safeguarding the human spirit. This was basic. As I was preparing these remarks, I went on YouTube and I got a wonderful, wonderful YouTube video that I recommend to all of you, which is of President Reagan giving a speech when he was not even governor of California yet at the 1964 Republican Convention. And he started out with an astonishingly astute anecdote. He said that it was 63, about 5 or 4 years after Castro had taken power, and a Cuban exile who had been a businessman in Castro's Cuba and had been mistreated terribly was talking about having come to America, and he was talking to 2 American businessmen, and the American businessmen were so moved by his story, they said, wow, this makes us so grateful to have been born in America. And the Cuban man said, you think you're lucky? I had somewhere to escape to. Where are you guys going to go if you lose your freedom? And that was what Ronald Reagan saw, that this was the shining city on the hill, a phrase he used often, and it's the perfect phrase. And if we fell to tyranny, there was nowhere to run to. And this basic informed everything he did. And he did a lot of thinking about this. People think he was a cowboy. He was splitting wood by hand, lived in a very modest ranch up in the Santa Barbara Mountains. And boy, for those of us who've been up there, that's a full-time job, just getting up that hill. Anyway, he did a lot of thinking and a lot of reading. He was an incredibly good-looking movie star. He was, as they say, movie star handsome. But back in the days when movie stars were handsome, and he was close friends with major intellectual lights of individual freedom like Bill Buckley and Milton Friedman. And I suspect he had read more about political liberty, what it means to the human spirit, than had any president of the 20th century besides him. He had read the founding documents of the nation. He had read them and he had thought about them. And he had his head on right about freedom. It was above everything else. It was above prosperity, above the welfare state, above anything else, since everything good flowed from human freedom. It was the numero uno value. It was, he realized, what being a human being was all about. You are not fully human unless you are free, and he believed that man was almost genetically programmed to want to be free if he was mentally healthy. If you were mentally sick, you didn't want to be free, possibly, or if you were mentally sick, you wanted to control other people's lives. But if you were mentally healthy, you wanted to live your own life, but you did not need to or want to control other people's lives, and you didn't want to be controlled. And he had this astonishingly important insight that if freedom was what men and women deeply wanted in their hearts, that freedom was bound to win out over communism. And it would need help in some spots on the globe because there are so many unhappy people out there who wanted to control other people, but freedom would win. He took that as an article of faith. And he went farther than this. He believed in his heart that because God had put America on the planet as the main repository of what was the best for the human spirit, that God had a special destiny for America, to help others to be free, to be that shining city, to be that beacon. And he summed this up in a magnificent phrase in a speech in 1983. He said, freedom would not defeat communism, freedom would transcend communism. That's incredibly important. And here we go to a word that comes to my mind all the time when I think of President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan, the simple word love. Ronald Reagan loved freedom so much, in large part because he loved mankind so much. He loved mankind and wanted mankind to have that most perfect gift from God, freedom. And that's why he meant it when he celebrated Captive Nations Week. He didn't just mean it as a ceremony. It wasn't a political ploy to get votes in certain cities. He meant it when he said that he had an idea about the Cold War. We win, they lose, the captive nations become free. That's why he meant it when he said that freedom is indispensable for the farmer in Poland and for the farmer outside Poland Springs, New York. And by the way, this very important little side note, I think this is why President Reagan wanted a strategic defense initiative. He wanted to protect America from nuclear attack, and in so doing, he would make nuclear war obsolete, unwinnable, and unthinkable. He wanted to protect his nation and at the same time this world from annihilation. And I will say that of all the objections to President Reagan's policies, I understand almost all of them. I can understand the objection to cutting taxes. In many ways, there are persuasive arguments on both sides. I can understand objections to almost any part of his policies, but how anyone could have objected to his wanting to be able to keep this nation free from annihilation, from nuclear attack, that's a total mystery to me. How could anyone not want that? How could anyone have objected to Mr. Bush 43's more recent wish to defend Europe and the U.S. from nuclear missiles? That's a mystery to me. Why would anyone object to that? If Mr. Reagan's plan, the Strategic Defense Initiative, had gone on, if we had it now, it would have rendered this planet far safer and more durable than any plan of trading oil wells for windmills in the Cajon Pass. It's just a deep secret in my mind why our leaders would not spend the money necessary to defend us from nuclear attack. But back to personalities. One of my best friends, an extremely smart man named Aram Bakshian, who toiled with me as a speechwriter for Mr. Nixon and then became head of the speechwriting shop under President Reagan, he was called by me sort of in the middle of the night, because I sometimes forget that it's different in the East. I'm only 65. I can't be expected to know everything. And I said, what would you say is the main difference between President Reagan, with whom you work quite closely, and the other presidents you've worked with? Because he has worked for just about every Republican president since Nixon. And he said, Ronald Reagan was a whole person. He was not tormented. He was not conflicted. He was at peace with himself and contented with himself, and certainly content with his lovely wife. He was completely unconflicted about himself, and he was completely unconflicted about his love of freedom and his ultimate belief that it would ultimately defeat communism and all other dictatorships. This distinguished him in a big way from other post-war presidents, even post-war Republican presidents, and great figures and great names in foreign relations with famous foreign accents. They generally thought that collectivism and the brute force of communist tyranny might well subjugate human freedom, and the best we could hope for was a lengthy rearguard delaying action. Mr. Reagan was different. He believed we would win. He was not only believing it, he was sure of it. He was sure that if man had even a slight choice, freedom would win. People want freedom. But to get there, they need leaders. Not Führers, but leaders. And Mr. Reagan was the leader that America needed in 1980. I'd like to ask us all, I see we have a fairly mature and seriously well-informed audience. I'd like us to cast our memories back to what America was like when Mr. Reagan took office on January 20, 1981. We can mostly recall the specific problems: energy crisis, gas lines, not exactly then, but a little bit before that, revolution in Iran, a little bit before that, seizure of our diplomats as hostages in Tehran and mocking us about it, inflation on a staggeringly high scale, persistently high unemployment. We remember all of those individual issues, and I'm sure many of us remember sitting in those gasoline lines, but we sometimes forget what was behind all of these problems: a failure of leadership. Americans and America were frightened because in a difficult world, in a world where the Soviets were on the march and seemed unstoppable, where Islamic fundamentalism had just reared its head and looked like trouble, where the economy was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, we as a nation had as our highest government officer a man who was timid and confused about America was and who he was. He genuinely seemed to think that by wearing a sweater on TV, he would change the course of history. We were led by a man who seemingly did not respect the nation he was leading and was worried about our being too proud of ourselves as Americans. We were led up until January 20th, 2081 rather, by a man who was worried about American exceptionalism and American triumphalism and thought we might need to apologize to the world for what we had inflicted upon the world. Those were the days. It's hard to believe this could have happened so recently when the president launched a pitiful rescue effort for the hostages in Iraq, and many of the helicopters, victims of a starved military, crashed in the Iranian desert. It's interesting to go back to those days because then people were buying and hoarding gold too, and because they feared the collapse of the whole edifice of democratic capitalism. We were still a great nation, but we were leaderless in terms of having a leader who believed in his own nation. Then we got the magnificent campaign of 1980, There You Go Again, and a new kind of sunrise, this time coming out of the West. And we got a whole new set of ideas about how the world worked, totally different from the defeatism and confusion of the time before Mr. Reagan took office. Now, people at the universities and the big foundations and in the media called Ronald Reagan's ideas reactionary and obsolete. How could America allow itself to be led by a man who believed in such obviously outdated ideas as individual freedom and human dignity, love of God, respect for the unborn, a strong defense, possibly conceivably transcending communism? How could we be led by a man who believed in such outdated values? That man was a cowboy, a danger, obsolete, backward. But it turned out that Mr. Reagan was the man on the cutting edge of human destiny. It turned out that freedom, not slavery, individual dignity, not incarceration and communism, those were the ideas that were what man had wanted and dreamed of. And in reviving the best ideas of America's past, Ronald Reagan was reviving the best ideas for humanity's future. He was reviving what was timeless and permanent in the human soul. Ronald Reagan's plans for America were the same as God's plans for the human spirit. He believed that totally in his heart, and I believe it too. I suspect every man and woman in this room believes it. It was the collectivists who were attacking what man basically was, not Ronald Reagan. It was interesting. The communists always talked about remaking man, the new Soviet man. Ronald Reagan took man as he came and said, we will work with that man who has a great deal of the angel inside him. And so instead of a big government to remake man, we got a bigger zone of individual freedom through lower taxes and less regulation. Instead of an inordinate fear of communism, as Mr. Carter had put it, we got a willingness to confront communism. Instead of more and more government, we got more and more human initiative. And instead of the public service employee union seeing government as a happy hunting ground to play around and to suck the blood out of, they saw a brick wall when Ronald Reagan taught the air traffic controllers that there is no right to strike against the public interest ever. Now, there were problems and setbacks. Not everything got done. We never got a human life amendment, which I believe is still a tragedy. I think the situation in this country in terms of abortion being legal and the just horrifying killing of over 1 million totally innocent human beings in the world, in the United States through abortion, that's just inexcusable. And we those of us who believe strongly in life are still sad that we didn't get a human life amendment. Ronald Reagan actually worked for it instead of just paying lip service, but it wasn't quite enough. We didn't get the Strategic Defense Initiative, which we got a beginning to it, but we desperately needed it then, and we need it even more now. It's interesting, very, very interesting to me, that the two things that the left fought hardest against, right to life and the Strategic Defense Initiative, were about saving the most lives. There's something interesting going on in the human heart. But anyway, by the time Reagan left office, Ronald Reagan left office, America was in the best shape ever, prosperous, confident, about to see the disintegration of the largest communist empire in the world. And yes, of course, that empire was the axis of evil, and only President Reagan had the guts to say it and to say the words that changed the world: Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It was genuinely Mourning in America, probably the best campaign commercial I've ever seen. Interestingly enough, very interestingly enough, saw a debate recently about what was the best TV campaign commercial. Came down to Mourning in America versus the 1964 Goldwater versus Johnson commercial of the little girl picking flowers, and then there's a gigantic nuclear explosion behind her, meant to imply that Barry Goldwater, a fine man who was really slandered by Johnson in that campaign, is meant to imply that he was going to lead us into nuclear war. And that was a viciously negative commercial, whereas Ronald Reagan's commercial about Mourning in America was a optimistic, cheerful commercial that really didn't hate anyone. And I don't know that Ronald Reagan did hate anyone. I have the feeling that he was so happy with himself that he just did not find in his heart to hate anyone. But that sun for Mourning in America rose spectacularly because of a man who led America out of his own bottomless well of self-confidence about himself and the shining city on a hill and the human spirit, and because of the great, great woman who stood behind him and with him in his crusade to rescue mankind from darkness. He had read the human spirit beautifully. He had led the nation beautifully. He believed. It's interesting. They asked me just before the speech started at a little tiny online news conference. They said, in one sentence, how would you sum up what made Reagan so great? The question was somewhat similar to that. And I said, he believed in America, and America believed in him. He believed in America, and America believed in him. Now, 21 years have passed since President Reagan left office. We face a very different world. We've had terrible setbacks and terrible calamities. Terrorism of 9/11, several recessions, including the most recent difficult one. I must say, I really actually had to laugh out loud when I read in the paper that the recession was over. That was a good one. That was really a good one. I thought to myself, well, yeah, when economists in universities are paid $200,000 a year to sit in their offices and read magazines, when they get replaced by Chinese economists getting paid 10 cents an hour, then we'll see whether the recession is over. I mean, I don't think there's ever a recession for economists, so I don't know. I guess they never really had a recession. But anyway, 21 years have passed. We've had terrible setbacks, terrible calamities, as I just said, 9/11, the recessions, the savings and loan collapse, the tech crash, now the most recent housing correction, we call it a correction instead of calling it a massacre, and a general malaise in the country. We face terrible, terrible divisions in this country. I don't worry about them as much as many other people do, because I think the nature of a free country is to have divisions, to have people differ with one another. I don't believe in this Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer idea. We have to be divided up because that's the way we are as people, but we are, I hope, always recognizing we're all Americans. We have a genuine crisis that is nowhere near adequately discussed in the media within the African American community. Just astounding rates of single-parent families, astounding rates of incarceration, astounding rates of intersection with the justice community, astounding rates of high school dropout, far, far lower earnings, wildly higher unemployment. Something very wrong is happening in the black community. Nothing much is being done about it. We have a nation that is losing control of who it is, largely because of open borders that we're just not willing to spend enough money keeping closed. And we have all these crises going on, and the recession was starting in a terrifying way. Of course, the media egging it on endlessly in 2008. So we got voters asking for a change. That wasn't surprising. We haven't quite gotten the change we were looking for. We got a president who started his administration, and God bless him, he's trying his best, by going around the world apologizing to the dictatorships and tyrannies of the world for what America, the ultimate beacon of freedom and generosity, had done to them. We got a president who sometimes doesn't seem to realize whose side he's supposed to be on in the struggle for human dignity. I cannot imagine, thank you. I cannot imagine, I literally cannot imagine Ronald Reagan ever apologizing for the United States of America that sent her sons and daughters out to save the world for freedom for the last century and only asked for enough space to bury them. And Colin Powell's fine words, but they sure make a lot of sense to me. I cannot imagine Ronald Reagan insisting on the right to build a mosque with a name that specifically celebrates Islamic triumphs over the West, the Cordoba Center, specifically celebrating a giant Muslim victory over Christianity in Europe. I cannot imagine that president endorsing the building of that one block from ground zero. He would have said, as I think everyone in this room says, we respect all faiths. We totally respect all faiths. We respect Muslims as much as we respect anyone else, but enough is enough. I cannot. And we do respect everyone in this country, but we don't respect people who kill other people. I cannot imagine Ronald Reagan saying that the path out of a severe recession. I must say that I really want to get a blow up of that headline saying the recession's over. That's good. I'm going to show it to all my friends who've lost their houses, all the friends who can't get jobs, all the friends who can't pay their student loans, all the friends who can't send their kids to college, all the friends who've gotten divorced because of the tension over it, all the friends who've had nervous breakdowns over it. I'll send that to them. It'll be a good joke. It'll really cheer them up a lot. I cannot believe that Ronald Reagan would ever say that the path out of a severe recession is higher taxes on the most productive citizens, more regulations, and more government mandates. I watched that speech, as I told you. I really recommend it to you. You can get it. It comes right up if you put in Ronald Reagan's speech to GOP in 1964 convention. And it jumped right up. It's 28 minutes, and it's pure bliss. I watched his speech to the GOP convention in 1964, and he said in that trademark way of his, I'm not even going to try to imitate this way, where he looked quite irritated, like he was teaching a class of very unruly children. He said that he was horrified that the federal government was spending $15 million a day more than it took in. Right now, our government is spending $4 billion a day more than we take in, and we're on track to get it up to $5 billion a day more. And Mr. Obama wants to spend a lot more on everything except defense, which is the one thing that's most needed. I could go on and on about the specifics of the contrast between the Reagan years and our years, but there's a general point to be made, and it's about leadership. We are in perilous times. We face an extremely relentless and dangerous enemy. That enemy wants to not hurt us, but destroy us, enslave us, or kill us. We face tremendous crises about the economy, the collapsing family, the public debt, which has reached a stage where it's just a joke to think that we could ever pay it off. We have a terrible situation about education. I taught for many years at the university level. I taught most recently, I guess I taught about for either 8 or 9 years at Pepperdine as an adjunct, and love Pepperdine like mad. But I have to say, even in the time I was teaching, from roughly 1970 to roughly 1995, I saw a very disappointing arc downward in the willingness of students to learn or study or try to accommodate themselves to anything except moving images. And I had an example about this that happened in my own little life a few years ago. We were making a TV show for a deep intellectual network called VH1, and it was called America's Most Smartest Model. And the idea was that we were going to take we took 16,000 young men and women from the greater LA area. They said they were aspiring models. I don't really want to think what they really were, but anyway, and we would ask them questions. How many of you could name 5 rivers in the United States of America? None. How many of you could name 5 different species of trees? Few could. Anyways, I say we whittled them down to 16, 8 men and 8 women, and we'd ask them questions like, what's the official language of Australia? Every single one of them said Australian. And so one day when we were having lunch out in the beautiful August 2007 sunshine on location. Two of the kids who had been on the show and who had just been kicked off the show for not answering enough questions came over and sat with me and asked if I would mind if they had lunch with me. I said, no, not at all, sit down. And they said, well, you sure know a lot, Ben. We're very impressed at how much you know. I said, well, it's partly because of how much older I am than you. But they said, well, how old are you, Ben? And I said, well, let's figure it out. It's a show about knowledge and intelligence. Let's figure out how old I am. I was born November 25th, 1944. It's now August 2007. How old am I? They said, we don't know. I said, I know you weren't born knowing, and you didn't wake up this morning knowing, but I've given you all the information necessary to figure it out. Well, how would we do that? Well, I said, it's not quite up to my birth date yet, so let's just subtract 44 from 106. Oh, they said, do you have a calculator? No, I don't have a calculator. Do you think you could do it in your head? No. Okay, I said, well, I'm 62. Ooh, that's old. I know. I said, I hope to get a little older. I said, I told you I was born in late 44. Do you know who was president when I was born? Young man raised his hand. It was a young man and a young woman. Young man raised his hand and says, Abraham Lincoln. No, I said, not Abraham Lincoln. I said, you want to guess again? The young woman says, Ronald Reagan. No, I said, no, way before Ronald Reagan. Oh, we can't think of any other presidents. Well, in a way, that's flattering that all they can think of as presidents is Ronald Reagan and Abraham Lincoln. But I said, you really can't think of any other presidents? No. Okay. Well, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Oh, we've heard of him. Great. You've only heard of the longest serving president in American history. You've heard of him. That's great. I said, now let me ask you another question. When I was born in late 1944, a giant international event was going on. What was it? What was it? We don't know. I said, well, I'm going to make it really simple for you. It was a conflict. It was not the first of its kind, and it was global in scope. What was it? We don't know. Okay, well, let me make it really easy. It was a war. It took place all over the world, and it was not the first of its kind. What was it? Young woman says, Civil War. No, I said, not the Civil War. Young man says, Vietnam War. No, not the Vietnam War. You really can't guess? No. Okay, it was World War II. Oh, we've heard of that. Great, you've heard of that. Let me ask you a question. Who did we fight against in World War II? Young man raises his hand very eagerly and says, Germany. Right, I said, very good, Germany. Who else did we fight against in World War II? Young woman raises her hand very eagerly and says, Russia. No, I said, Russia was on our side in World War II, and a very good thing at that. And so the young man raises his hand and says, Germany. I said, no, you just said Germany. You can't say it again. So the young woman raises her hand and says, Russia. I said, no, you already said Russia, and I already said that was wrong. I said, I'm going to make it really simple. The war took place in the European theater of operations, where our primary enemy was Germany, and it also took place in the Pacific theater. Now, who was our primary opponent in the Pacific theater of operations? The young man looks very confident. Now he's got it nailed. He says, Germany. No, I said, Germany is in Europe. It's not in the Pacific. Okay, I asked the young woman, would you like to take a final guess? Yes. Russia. No, I already told you over and over again, Russia was our ally in World War II. Okay, I said, look, it was an island nation, a large island, fairly warm at certain times of the year, very tough opponent. What enemy? What was it? Young man says, Cuba. No, not Cuba. It was Japan. Oh my gosh, the young woman says, we fought a war against Japan. Who won? Well, I said we're all eating sushi all the time, so I guess we know who won. Anyway, it's kind of a funny story, but it's also a very sad story, and I see this kind of thing over and over and over again. This is not a unique or terribly surprising story, and I'm not sure we have a leader in this country now who believes in how we can fix this as much as how we can keep the fix in with the teachers union. We need a leader who goes around the world not saying how bad we are and how we've been too arrogant. We need a leader who says, pay attention to what we do. Look, We don't see mass exoduses of taxi drivers from the Simi Valley going to work in Pakistan. There's something going on about that. There's something going on about that. We have to have an idea, I think, of why that's happening. Tony Blair said when asked why he was so pro-American, he said, well, I have a very easy way of deciding whether a country is a great country. How many people want in and how many want out? I think the question answers itself. We need a leader who is up to the crisis of morale in this country. We are confronted with every kind of challenge. We're blinking. Ronald Reagan would not have blinked. He would have said, our best days lie ahead. We're not going to get to those new days by kowtowing to the people and movements who want to destroy us, nor by withdrawal and leaving the job undone in the places where we're fighting. We're not going to get to a new morning in America by endless new tax and endless new spending and a president who openly talks about keeping his foot on the neck of business. We're going to need a president who believes wholeheartedly that freedom is man's destiny. A president who thinks his job is to teach Americans and remind Americans of our great birthright, not a president who thinks we're bullies because we defend ourselves. I keep thinking, if the trumpet giveth forth an uncertain sound, who shall come to battle? But we are getting an uncertain sound now from Pennsylvania Avenue, and it's a scary sound. It's a sound about defending America, not enough, about letting down our closest allies, about our commitment to our young and as compared to the commitment to the teachers union, about a commitment to the lifeblood of American employment, small business. Now, this does not mean, I think President Obama had this right. He said this does not mean endlessly saying no to everything the president proposes. It means initiatives from conservatives, initiatives from people who believe in the Reagan-esque vision of America. It means our own initiatives, our own ideas, our own confidence in place of his fearfulness, our own American pride for his reticence and equivocation. Ronald Reagan knew that in this country the issue was not right versus left, it was right versus wrong, and standing up for freedom is always right every time. So now, thank you. So now it's our turn to say we're not going to let ourselves be pushed around. Things look bad sometimes. We've had difficult days. We've certainly been let down by many on Wall Street. The mainstream media, sometimes good, I'm on it. Sometimes it's we wonder whose side they're on. But if you want inspiration about where this country is going, if you want to pluck yourself out of the morass of depression about what this country's come to, come with me sometime on a trip. I live part of the week in Malibu. And people say to me all the time, oh, you live in Malibu. You don't have to worry about these problems of broken families and ganglion murders and poverty and so forth. You live out near the stars. And I always say, I do live near some well-known actors. Nick Nolte is a friend. He's a very interesting actor. I have lived near Martin Sheen. He's a great guy, a very active Democrat, but a great guy. I live near Barbara Streisand, who has a voice like butter. But I always say they're not the real stars. They are highly paid performers and usually very talented. But there are real stars in this country, and the real stars are putting on body armor, and they are going off to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, wearing the shoulder patch of wearing the shoulder patch of the United States of America. And if you want to come with me to Washington, D.C. sometime, I go there a lot. And I usually, as soon as I've unpacked, my first stop is at the orthopedic ward of the glorious Walter Reed Army Medical Center. And I go over there and I see soldiers who've had their limbs blown off by IEDs, who've had their stomachs blown out by IEDs, who've had sniper rounds into their shoulders, into their elbows, into their knees, and lost their legs. And they've had 30 surgeries in 60 days. They're just endlessly getting work done. They're in terrible pain. They're doped up. And you know what? They have American flags on their walls. And they're very, very proud to be Americans. I have never seen so much pride in being in America as I do in these people who are in so much pain. If you could see these people, you would be so uplifted, and see the nurses and doctors who care for them, you would be uplifted. People say to me all the time, how can you stand to go there day after day? It's a privilege to go there day after day. It's an unbelievable privilege. And usually after I go there, if it's the time of year when it's bright enough to go, if the sun stays up late enough to go, I will go over to Arlington National Cemetery. And I go to the sections where the dead are buried from Afghanistan and Iraq, and I know very well where it is because it's very near where my father-in-law is buried. And the soil is still soft and moist because the burials are so recent. There are stuffed teddy bears leaning up against the cars. Stuffed teddy bears and model cars like the decedent's car leaning up against the stones, gravestones. There are football jerseys, pictures of the man with his children and his wife. And the parents are there weeping, the widows are there weeping, the children are there weeping. And I think to myself, what did we ever do to deserve such magnificence? What did we ever do to deserve it? And I'm standing there weeping myself. I'm looking over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. I see the flags over the State Department, flags over the Lincoln Memorial, flags over the Federal Reserve. And I think to myself, what an astonishing bargain God has allowed us to strike. They gave their lives, and we get to live in this glorious freedom. They're the real stars. They're the real stars. They include not only men and women in the United States military, but the police, the firefighters, the teachers who really want to teach, don't really just want to make trouble, and immortal leaders like Ronald and Nancy Reagan. And thanks to their belief and our duties to God, we're going to get through these difficult days. We are facing, as I endlessly say, difficult days, but we're America, the last best hope of mankind. And we're going to get through these days. That is not my phone. And we will get through them, I hope, with the right spirit of our heart. And that spirit might be summed up by the words of another great movement that aimed at human freedom. We are not afraid, we shall not be moved, and we shall overcome. Thank you, Mrs. Reagan, and God bless you all, and God bless Ronald Reagan. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
2 questions?
Thank you very much. 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 Very kind of you. Thank you very much. And I spoke way too long. I guess that's what that noise was telling me I was going on too long. Did you ever notice how much he looks like a better looking version of Glenn Beck? Kind of interesting. Anyways, if we could take just 2 questions, if we have time, if we have 2 very insightful, non-hurtful questions.
Right here?
Can't be anything that'll hurt my feelings.
Yeah, please.
Yes.
Hi, Ben. I'm Debbie Gregory. And I want to hear about
Yes, from TAPS.
Right, well, from Military Connection and TAPS. I want
yes.
to hear about your book, The Real Heroes.
I'm sorry?
I want to hear about the real heroes.
The Real Stars. Well, it's a book I wrote about just what I say, just about how each of us goes off to do what we think is important in the day. We go off to do our jobs or get the car washed or take our kids to school or take the dogs to the vet. And any of these things is mildly important, but the people who get up in the morning not knowing whether they'll come back alive or dead in return for giving us our freedom, they're the real stars. There's only one real star in America, and that's a man or woman who puts his life on the line for the rest of us. They're the real stars. Yes, right there.
At the United Nations, President of Iran said the world's troubles are capitalism. Mm-hmm. Do you think that President Obama wrote his speech?
No, I don't think so, because that's an interesting question. President Obama's attitude toward capitalism is quite interesting. He obviously is not what I would call a wholehearted free enterprise guy. I think that would be putting it kind of modestly. But on the other hand, he's surrounded by Wall Street types and Wall Street types. I mean, Rahm Emanuel, his ballerina friend at the White House, got at one point after just a few months of steering bond business, municipal bond business from the Chicago and Illinois area to some investment bank, got like an $8 million bonus for less than a year's work. Larry Summers, a genuinely great economist. I really don't have much bad to say about him, but he's very close to Mr. Obama. He got paid something like $5 or $6 million for a few hours a month consulting for a Wall Street firm. Mr. Geithner, you may be very sure, is going to wind up at Goldman Sachs. He likes having Wall Street guys around him, but he doesn't. I'm not sure how much Wall Street is really American business. It's sort of a different animal, sort of like a hybrid between American business and Count Dracula. So I don't think he wrote the speech, but I don't think he writes his own speeches either. Anyway, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You've been very kind.
Thank you all very much. If I could ask, if you could please just remain in your seats while Mrs. Reagan and her guests are escorted out this way, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, everybody.